Daniel, welcome to Climate Conversations. So let's start with the obvious. Plastic. We love it. We hate it. We wrap our food in it, build our gadgets with it, and then act completely shocked when it doesn't disappear when we throw it away. I mean, we've been using plastic for over a century or more. And here is the basic plot twist that 91% of it is never recycled or has never been recycled so far. It's like having a roommate who's never done the dishes, but instead of one sink full of plates, we now have a garbage island floating in the Pacific Ocean. And yet, you and SYSTEMIQ both believe that we can rewrite the rules here, that circularity can work, that even though big oil is hoping that we get and we stay addicted to plastics, we don't have to choose between economic growth and a livable planet. So welcome to the show, Daniel.
Yeah.
Maybe before we figure out how to fix this, you can tell our audience a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Daniel. I'm based in London and I work for a company called SYSTEMIQ. And you introduced us well just then, but SYSTEMIQ are a system change consultancy and we work across a number of different topics. So we work across nature, food and land use. We look at sustainable finance, projects, materials and circular economy, which is what I'm part of, and then also energy and energy use. So we try and combine kind of working with pioneering companies as well as coalitions to really come up with some of the big solutions that we need right now. And started at SYSTEMIQ around 2 years ago. And before that, I've got a background in economics and have a master's degree in environmental technology from Imperial.
Super cool. What is one thing that no one knows about you, but the audience would be like shocked to know, surprised to know, if you're willing to share?
Wow, you put me on the spot. That no one knows about me.
Or maybe some people know about you, but my audience definitely doesn't.
I am super excited to be visiting Japan in a couple of weeks' time for my 30th birthday.
That is super cool. And what are you most looking forward to in Japan?
Yeah, I think just like how different the culture will be compared to what I'm used to. I've traveled a little bit around Asia, but never been to Japan. It'll be interesting to see how efficient everything works over there, but also how different it is. And also the food, for sure, will be a big pull for me.
Yeah, definitely. That could be very cool. I myself have never been, but hoping someday. And maybe a little bit off topic or on topic, but I don't know if you heard Donald Trump reversing the ban on plastic straws recently.
Yeah,
You
I
have
did.
any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's many thoughts I've had about Donald Trump, but I think the plastic straws thing is just such a small part of the plastic issue. And so when we think about plastic straws, you automatically think about, that turtle in the ocean that maybe has a plastic straw up its nose.
Mm.
And that is kind of one of the images of climate change and plastic pollution. But plastic straw, it's just a drop in the ocean for the plastic just as a whole. When Donald Trump is reversing this ban, it's a step backwards, but it's still, there's still so much more that we need to do to try and overcome the plastic crisis. So yeah, it's not great, but it's such a small part of the issue.
Yeah, no, so true. It's also that the leader of a big democracy, of one of the largest democracies, is making this point blank statement, almost as if to say, hey, this is not the issue. You guys are concentrating on the wrong thing. It's almost like you have your house on fire and say, oh, wait, the water is too wet, so I'm just going to let it burn down. True, paper straws weren't really the best option. It was one of the things that people came up with. And there's this whole article on the White House website that they write why paper straws are bad for you. But there's like other routes that they could have taken that could have involved things which were more circular, so to speak.
Yeah. You've also got to ask yourself whether we as a human race even need straws for the consumption of beverages. That's one of the founding concepts of the circular economy is reduce. Can we think of a way in which we don't need to put this particular material on the market? So yeah, straws are just one issue. It's the fact that the White House are framing it in such a way, you've also got to think about the incentives that Donald Trump has and who's backing his campaign. And he's clearly cozying up to a lot of the big petrochemical companies, and this benefits them. So there are incentives behind every single decision.
Exactly. Maybe just for a second, you could help us form the relationship between plastic straws and the big petrochemical companies. We know the statement that, big oils will benefit from us staying addicted to plastics, but maybe to a 5-year-old, how would you explain it?
Think about the history of plastics and how it came about. And ultimately, our use of plastic has boomed in the past century. Looking back 100 years ago, you would never see the amount of plastic we have on our streets, being collected, being washed up on beaches. And it's because of this, and because of how amazing actually plastic is as a material. We've got to actually think about how super lightweight it is, how cheap it is, and how amazing its properties are in order to keep the products that we value protected. And so really, we've seen a massive increase in plastic use over the past 100 years. But plastic ultimately is oil. And so how do we make plastic? We have to use petrochemicals. And so when we talk about the linkages between plastic and emissions, plastic is simply oil. And so the less we can make of it, the less we need it, will only benefit us.
Right. I mean, just to put some numbers on it, plastic alone is responsible for 1.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year, which is nearly, surprisingly, 4 times the total emissions of UK alone. And it's just getting worse. I mean, the world is on track to triple plastic production by 2050. So maybe let's take this moment to get real with the audience and discuss why we actually are trying to solve this problem, or are we just making waste more efficient here?
Yeah, and I think you can frame the problem in a few different ways, and you framed it from an emissions perspective, which is clearly very important. And the connection between the petrochemical industry and plastics means that significant amounts of emissions are produced whenever we are producing anything that's made of plastic. And so you touched upon it, 1.8 billion tons of plastic of carbon emissions is attributed to plastic every single year. It's just one part of a much bigger environmental problem. And the pollution is a significant part because hardly any of this stuff actually gets recycled. Around 95% will not be recycled today. And although there's different formats which are better recycled than others, so for example, PET bottles, especially in places that have good waste management infrastructure, like Europe, like the US, are recycled at quite a reasonable rate, but still nowhere near 100%. And then you've more challenging formats like flexible plastics, which are recycled at under 5% globally today. And a lot of this is an economics question. So a lot of it comes down to the value that we place on this on the market, and also its value at end of life as well. But coming back to the environmental issues, waste and pollution, clearly a massive part of it. You've also got to think about the health impacts of plastic. And in quite a lot of research recently on how plastic, interacts with the human body, how microplastics can enter the food chain and ultimately impact really detrimentally on our health. And I think the overall broad scientific consensus at the moment is that no amount of plastic is good. It's being found anywhere from newborn babies, because it's within the centers of pregnant women, and it has really detrimental health impacts. And so, emissions, waste, health, just 3 key things that make this problem so challenging, but also so bad.
Agree so much about it, especially the microplastics in the human blood thing. It just means some of us are just walking around like bargain bin action figures, 50% water, 50% plastic. Absolutely crazy, and couldn't agree more. And this is more than an emissions problem. It's about economics, a political issue as well. Because if you ask certain governments, you get 200 different answers to the same question. Some governments are leading the charge. Some are banning plastic bags, like you said, but like ignoring everything else, or recycling the plastic bottles. And some, like the US, are debating whether to even regulate the waste at all.
Yeah.
So it's just recently I was reading a report that said half of future oil demand growth will come from plastics. So while we're out here switching to Teslas and solar panels, big oil is quietly making sure we never break up with plastic. So fighting plastic waste is directly fighting the fossil fuel industry as well, just to back up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, plastic and fossil fuels go hand in hand, essentially. And if there's one thing that the listeners can take away from this podcast is that there is such a big connection between plastic and oil fuels emission. And you mentioned a few key like countries doing good things there. Again, it's at quite a small scale, and we need so much more than just banning plastic bags because it's so much bigger than that. And one of the really interesting things in the plastic world over the past couple of years has been this plastics treaty that started, I think, in 2023. It's still ongoing, a really interesting development within the world of plastics. And it aims to essentially build a global treaty, a global consensus on what we do about this. And I think it has some really big potential to overcome some of the issues that we've got. However, because of the nature of international agreements and the power of the veto, and because there needs to be 100% consensus on every single line that's written within a treaty, you easily have the big petrochemical players, so countries like the US, countries like the Middle East, that will automatically say no because their economies directly benefit from the continued production of plastic. And so this makes a ambitious treaty quite difficult. And so what we're probably likely to see will be what we call like a treaty of the willing. So a group of highly ambitious countries, maybe 100, 120 countries that do sign a highly ambitious treaty that can help start to stop plastic pollution.
The IEA, the International Energy Agency, confirms what you're saying, with the fact that by 2050, if we don't act, plastics will consume more oil than cars, trucks, and planes combined. So that's just to say, again, this is not just a plastics issue or an emissions issue. There's also, how you very frequently put it before, a waste crisis issue as well. You think about fast fashion and the 92 million tons of textile that it's wasting annually, or a textile dyeing alone that pollutes enough water to fill 2 million Olympic-sized pools per year.
Yeah.
And the thing is, most of the climate conversation is still have you tried using a reusable water bottle?
Yeah, it's still just not at the level we need. And textiles are a huge issue because over 2/3 of all fiber production for use in textiles today is synthetic. So largely that's polyester, but that could be materials like nylon. And so this just makes, because these materials, they last for hundreds, if not thousands of years, if we don't deal with them correctly, it just makes it super difficult to manage effectively. And so 85% of all clothes are thrown to landfill every single year. There's not that many options for recycling of textiles and clothing, and especially not closed loop recycling. And when I say closed loop, I mean essentially producing the same product that it was previously when it gets recycled. Because often, if you are to recycle a polyester t-shirt or a cotton t-shirt, it would get downcycled into something which isn't as valuable. And that's one of the big issues with recycling is downcycling. And the fact that we aren't producing a closed loop that is fully sustainable. But yeah, textiles is a fascinating problem.
Absolutely agree. It also points to the fact that we put all the pressure on the consumers instead of fixing the system. So we treat waste like an individual behavior problem, but it's really a policy and a business model problem. I mean, no one is out here demanding more single-use plastic. Consumers aren't the ones that are pushing for fast fashion brands to release 52 micro seasons per year. But companies frame it like we are the problem. The individuals are the problem. Like, if you just recycle better, we'll fix this. The need is basically redesigning the system so that waste isn't the default and to move to circularity. And this gives us a nice segue for you to help. So imagine like there's a child sitting, the adults are listening to this episode in their car and the child is strapped in the back seat and he is listening in the middle of, hoping for getting his chicken nuggets or something. And let's hope our explanation for circularity reaches him and he understands what circularity is. So how would you explain it to a 5-year-old?
Often people think of circularity, that's just recycling, right? And whenever I tell people that I work in sustainability, they say, oh, recycling then, isn't it? But it's so much more than that. And circularity is all about keeping resources in use for as long as possible and ultimately keeping waste out of the environment. And if we think about it in those terms, recycling is actually quite far down the list. I've mentioned it before, this idea of closed loop. And often circular economists talk about closed loop as like the holy grail of circularity. And the reason for this is because whenever you put a material into the system and it goes through a life cycle, closed loop essentially would ensure that whatever you put in, you get back. And that could be through repairing, it could be through reusing, it could be through remanufacturing, or it could be through a very good level of recycling. But the problem is with recycling is that for every loop that a particular piece of material is going through the system, it loses quality, so it degrades. And so you think about like a PET bottle, so Coca-Cola bottle, for example. That is, by all means today, a recyclable bottle. However, it can only go through so many loops of recycling before we have to, what we call downcycle it, ultimately put it into a material that's of lower quality. And therefore, that isn't fully closed loop. And so there's many different frameworks around circularity, but a lot of them focus on these like the different R's of the circular economy. And recycling is right down the list. It's almost next to landfill. And so if we are really to be like fully sustainable and move towards a fully sustainable system, we need to think about reducing, ultimately questioning whether we even need this particular material on the market. Can we use a different material potentially, or we even need the material? Can we remanufacture the product so that we don't even need any packaging? To like repairing, ultimately keeping products in the loop for a much longer time by repairing the product if it's suddenly broken, or if my t-shirt's torn, can I take it to, a cobbler who can help me keep it in the state in which I bought it? And so recycling, it's just one part of the equation, but actually it should be relatively low priority compared to some of these other circular economy principles. Hopefully that.
I'm going to attempt though a little bit more to simplify it for a 5-year-old. I don't know. You can let me know if I'm getting the metaphor right, but walk with me like I'm taking this on the go. To explain it to a 5-year-old kid, maybe we start with a box of crayons. So imagine you have a box of crayons. Now, every time you color, instead of putting the crayons back in the box, you throw them in the trash. And after a few days, you're out of crayons. So what do? You go beg your parents for more crayons, and they go, well, fine, I'll buy you another box. But every time you keep throwing them away, and at some point your parents are like, well, this is getting very expensive. And you're very confused as a 5-year-old because you thought that crayons were unlimited. And that's how our economy works. We take materials from nature, turn them into stuff and use them once and then boom, into the trash. So we're digging up more resources to make more stuff just to keep up.
It's a great explanation, yeah. And no, you've done a much better job than me. Like the finite resources issue is huge. We live on a planet that has finite resources, but we're treating it like it doesn't. Like there's infinite resources available for us to take and extract and make things. But ultimately, we need to find ways to co-inhabit with our Earth in ways which means that we don't destroy it, right? So that's ultimately is all about circular economy and what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, exactly. So kids, instead of throwing away your crayons, you need to sharpen them, reuse them, or melt them into new colors if you want. Parental advice required. So we're never running out. We're never wasting and never needing to beg for more. But let's not kid ourselves. I mean, it's like, I like new crayons because old crayons are boring. And that's how corporations act, that their consumers are basically saying that.
Yeah, to some extent, it's super unfair to put on the consumer. And corporations ultimately are the ones marketing all of this and shoving these new products that we probably don't need down our throats, right? And so fast fashion, you mentioned that before, seen a huge boom in the past 10, 15, 20 years. Even like the likes of Zara, H&M, I consider those to be like a fast fashion house. But the new likes of Shein and Temu, ultra fast fashion, which are 10x, 20x worse than these players that we see on the high street in Britain. And they are producing so many different lines of clothing, but you've then got people just over consuming it. And clothing has just become something that we purchase way more often and use way less. So there's a great graph by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is a circular economy non-profit, that pits usage of clothing versus like how much we're using it over time. And you can quite clearly see a massive correlation between the two, in that we are buying such low quality stuff in such high quantities. We end up using it 2-3 times and throwing it away. And so this linear system of just buying something and throwing it away is completely broken, and it just means that we need to move to more circular approaches. And luckily, there are some really cool business models out there, which means that it is possible to do.
Let's explore that. I mean, instead of how do we go from treating the planet like a dumpster fire, how can we actually design waste out of the equation here?
Maybe I can give an example within fashion, which is Recommerce. So lots of your listeners will probably have used sites like Vinted, sites like Bot, which essentially enable a circular economy because it's enabling this secondhand fashion. And that will mean that, a discarded item that I potentially don't want can be used and loved by someone else. And so you're keeping it in the system. So rather than me throwing it away, I can benefit by, essentially recouping some of the cash that I spent on that item and keep the item going. And it will ultimately mean that the purchaser of that secondhand item doesn't demand a brand new t-shirt, jumper, pair of trousers. And that will mean that less of this is being produced, which will ultimately lead to less emissions and less waste. And so I think these business models are really interesting because even as a consumer, I don't need to care about sustainability to want to shop secondhand fashion. And a lot of the big question marks with circular business models is that it costs more. Therefore, I don't care about it. There's a green premium associated with it. Mm-hmm. And so in order to incentivize the average consumer out there, where cost is the biggest driving factor affecting their purchasing habits, you need to make the green option cheaper than the virgin option. And that's what circular secondhand fashion sites like Depop and Vinted do, because you're not only getting a good bargain, but you're also helping the planet at the same time. So it plays into this idea of cost. And so if circularity is really going to take off as a business model, ultimately, we need to make it more affordable. And at the moment, we're not really there yet. And a lot of the big reasons is because there's an inappropriate price on virgin production. How can we get there? Carbon tax, potentially, which would make that more expensive and therefore make the green option more attractive. Could be one option. But I think that example of Recommerce and secondhand fashion is a great way in which you can place both sustainability as well as affordability.
I definitely do see this working with like Patagonia's one web program as well. Yeah. IKEA's furniture buyback schemes are huge successes. And if I'm not wrong, they're making higher margins on resold items than the new ones itself. So for companies, there seems to be an incentive to be doing so.
But think about it, right? In terms of the Patagonia, there is a big incentive for them to make more money from a proprietary, i.e. a Patagonia-owned second-hand sales platform, because they can not only get the revenue from selling it firsthand, but they can source revenue from selling it a second time. So they would be like a bit of a buyback scheme. So say this is a Patagonia fleece. For example, if I choose I can sell this back to Patagonia at a certain price. They would then put it on their worn wear program and they will sell it at a bit more expensive than what they gave to me. So there's the opportunity to gain revenue both the first sale and the second sale. And so it can be lucrative for these businesses to move into circularity models.
And even with the reusable packaging systems, I think companies like Loop and, if I'm not wrong, Algramo, they're redesigning how we buy everyday products like detergents, coffees, shampoos without single-use plastic.
Yeah.
There's high value in like textile recycling as well, with the brands like Stuff that are turning old clothes back into high quality new fiber instead of downcycling them into rags. So they're upcycling. We've been talking about downcycling a little bit, but there's virtue in upcycling as well. But can companies actually make money from circularity? Like, is this true for most industries? Because the way it's marketed, you think it's the only way to be sustainable is to be broke, live in a hut, wash your clothes in a river, don't wash your hair at all, things of that sort. Are circular businesses something other than charity?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think companies can make money from this as long as it's designed in an appropriate way. SYSTEMIQ wrote a really interesting report called Everything as a Service that was published a few years ago, which looked at a few different industries and how certain circularity business models like rental, like secondhand sales, can actually be profitable for these companies. I gave the example of Patagonia. They could make money on both the first sale and the second sale with their Recommerce platform. It comes down to a lot of these businesses, they don't want to change. They are making significant amounts of revenue through the current system of make, wake, taste. So this current linear system, which is just wasting. And so they don't have much of an incentive at the moment to move into circularity other than this kind of first mover advantage, because there is a proportion of the population out there that do care about sustainability and therefore are happy to pay a bit of a green premium on packaging that's more sustainable. For example, it might be in fiber-based packaging rather than plastic. And so there could be an incentive for these brands to say, hang on, maybe if I go first and be a first mover, I could capture a significant proportion of that market. And in that way, they would gain revenue, potentially gain new customers by doing it. And so, yeah, there is definitely opportunities out there.
Basically, the idea that circularity isn't profitable is definitely just bad economics at this point. Maybe even worse than that, because like you mentioned, maybe it's easier to sell you 10 cheap t-shirts than design 2 that last.
It needs to be designed well, but it can make businesses money. But I think what's most important is convenience. So for the consumer to buy a more sustainable product that's potentially circular, it still has to be just as convenient for them to do so over purchasing the unsustainable option. And so you mentioned Loop and their amazing work they're doing with reusable packaging. Fantastic. I think it's a great idea. I see it as a way to dramatically change how we interact with supermarkets in the future. But ultimately, at the moment, it doesn't exist in every supermarket. It's maybe a little bit more expensive to do, but for the consumer to, for example, take in their reusable plastic tin or their aluminium tin or their metal tin, fill up with whatever product they want, is slightly less convenient than just going into your local supermarket and picking up that bag of pasta or that bag of rice, whatever it is, than refilling. We need to make sure that we make it as convenient for the consumer as possible. And only then will we truly see the value in the system come. And you can see it also with secondhand fashion. I was praising it earlier, but it's still far easier for me to go down the high street or go online and purchase Patagonia fleece firsthand than it is to search for the exact thing that I want on the secondhand platform because of ubiquity. I easily know that if I go and buy it firsthand, that t-shirt will be in stock in my size and my color, whereas it might take me, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes to search online in the secondhand platform to find the exact same thing or the thing that I'm looking for. So that convenience angle is massively important. And I'd say just as important as cost and sort of this thing.
Couldn't agree more. To make this easier for the listeners to follow, I'm just going to recap this section a little bit. Now, we covered that circularity isn't just better recycling. It's much, much, much better than recycling. It's a total redesign of how we use materials. We're already seeing circular models succeed with a lot of fast fashion companies as well. Companies are still resisting the shift. The biggest barrier that we are seeing isn't really just technology or the systems. It's a broken incentive system. It's a question of convenience, like Daniel just mentioned. So now we're going to try moving on to the big question here, right? If we actually scale circularity globally, how much waste and carbon dioxide could we actually eliminate? Let's discuss what's the real impact here. So we're moving to my favorite section of the podcast, which is quantifying the impact. Are you ready for this?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, so Daniel, let's talk numbers. Climate targets are just about vibes. They're also about the math. Right now, we emit about 51 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. And that's our global problem statement. And if we want to hit net zero by 2050, we have to bring that number as close to zero as possible, as fast as possible. So my question is, if we scaled circular solutions globally, how much of that 51 billion ton pie could we actually cut?
$1 million question. Yeah, I think super hard to quantify. I think you kind of look at how global emissions today are split up, and I see circularity being able to affect a significant proportion of the sectors. It's not just how much plastic contributes, like plastic production contributes to emissions. It's not just how much textiles and clothing contributes to emissions. Circularity can then impact the manufacturing sector, like manufacturing of electric vehicles, for example, if we were to move towards ways in which we can recycle and reuse batteries much more effectively.
I put in my research as well because I love answering this question with my guests. I did not include manufacturing into it yet, although I know certain companies like Cattle are a great example of how they're incorporating circularity into their business models already. Like you said, it covers multiple industries. Let's start with plastics, consider textile and fashion, and let's consider packaging, for example. So plastics is covering about 1.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually. Textiles and fashion is covering about 2.1 billion tons, and packaging covers 500 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. Now, if we scaled reuse, recycling, and material substitution for plastics, for example, we could cut up to 1 billion tons per year for plastics. For textile and fashion, considering all Recommerce, circular textiles, and fiber recycling as well, could eliminate another 1.5 billion tons from that pool. And let's say better packaging design, reusable systems, and fiber-based alternatives as well over there could cut another 300 million tons from that pool. And this is not even counting manufacturing and EV sort of electronic waste as well. So we could easily, and this is a projection, this is the best case scenario. Well, not exactly. Let's not consider, it's a really good case scenario, but we could cut up to 45 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, which is 10% of the total emissions that we need to eliminate. Just from fixing how we use materials. How crazy is that? Because for comparison, that's more than all the emissions from global aviation and shipping.
Yeah, it's big, and ultimately, like if you look around the room that you're sat in, or if you just walk down the street, everything comes from materials. Every single thing would have started its life at some point as a molecular structure. Just shows how important if we are to really go for circularity as a potential lever to sorting out the climate and waste crisis, then it impacts basically everything. And so we need to make sure that we design to keep products in use for as long as possible, and that we have a system that incentivizes correct disposal. But yeah, you're right. I think it could be massive. I haven't personally done the numbers. From your explanation, it does seem like it would be big. But I think it goes beyond the topics that we've just discussed today. It goes far beyond plastics and textiles. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, and not even forgetting the world generates about 50 million tons of electronic waste per year. And that's like throwing away 1,000 laptops every single second. So we're out here treating MacBooks like disposable coffee cups.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. Like most of that e-waste contains valuable materials like gold, copper, rare earth materials. And instead of recovering them, we're literally burying billions of dollars in landfills.
Yeah. And I read the other day that the average EU citizen has, I think, 10 kilograms or so of just electrical waste in their house. I don't know about you, but I've got a drawer in my house that just has kind of a few old mobile phones, multiple different cables and stuff. And if we were to take all of that material, make sure it's recycled properly, then that means that we wouldn't be demanding as much materials in terms of the mining of those rare earth metals, of those materials that we need to build the electric vehicles. If we recycle what's already in existence, then we don't need to rely so much on that virgin production, which a massive shift and a massive emission saver.
I have that drawer too. I have all my old iPhones, well, the ones that didn't break into like actual shards, because a lot of the iPhones were like extremely easily breakable.
Yeah. So the UK at the moment has got a really cool marketing campaign around electrical waste, prompting consumers to go into that drawer and take what they have and essentially recycle it properly, either at their local recycling unit or there's specific places set up, for example, in work and schools that make it convenient for them to take, and then they'll get picked up by a specialist recycler that can extract the materials that we value from them. Really interesting work, especially around waste. And e-waste is only going to get bigger and worse. I don't know too much about it myself, but I know SYSTEMIQ are definitely doing some work on it at the moment.
Just to let you in on a little secret, that definitely sounds great, but the reason I keep my old iPhones is hoping that few years down the line, it'll become like a retro thing. It'll become big.
So it's vintage and you'll be able to sell it for more money.
Exactly. I mean, remember the clamshell Apple laptops?
Yeah.
And I always wanted one because, of course, Legally Blonde. Don't anyone sue me for it. But of course, I didn't have it at that point of time. I don't even remember when Legally Blonde came out, but maybe I was born, I wasn't born. I'm not really sure. Not the point, but it's just that I recently had been looking through, old laptops again. It's like $600 or something for an actual like old clamshell laptop. So I'm like, okay, maybe my phones could go for something like that.
Yeah, but maybe one day. Yeah, but you'll be in the money for sure.
I mean, circularity definitely sounds great. And, it would be great to figure out if it's profitable as well. I mean, it's working for certain companies, but I think it would make sense to define how insanely expensive waste ends up being, because through my research, I came across how the global economy loses, and don't quote me on it, but these are the figures that I did find, loses about $2.6 trillion per year due to waste materials that could have been recovered, reused, or repurposed. And that's more than the GDP of France. So we're literally throwing away the entire economy of France every single year. So just for the people who are saying circularity is too expensive, it's like someone burning a pile of cash and then saying, I cannot afford groceries this month.
Billions of dollars of material are thrown away every single day. And so you've got to think about the cost of production for something as simple as a single-use piece of plastic packaging. Use it for 30 seconds. And yes, it was cheap to make, but you add up everything that was made and it amounts to masses and masses of amounts of money. And so it makes sense to try and capture that value and put it back into a system which is more circular.
So we talked about problems. Now let's maybe talk about solutions, because it's not just about avoiding waste. It's about turning that waste into economic opportunity. And you did mention Recommerce earlier. I'm imagining like you worked on the subject as well with SYSTEMIQ. How big of an impact do you reckon we're talking about here, talking about scaling all of this?
Difficult again to say. I think you've got to look at the tons of clothing that's being produced today, and if you can keep more clothing in the loop, that will help basically reduce the demand for virgin and first-hand pieces. If really tough to quantify, like the impacts that Recommerce could make. I think there are some really good reports out there. A lot of the solutions, yes, are business led to make some revenue out of circularity. Some of them need to come from regulation and legislation, essentially. Trying to put more of a price on putting products that are, I don't know, badly designed for recycling onto the market. And this is kind of across the world at the moment, in which governments are trying to implement schemes which essentially put a bit of a carbon tax, or like a waste tax almost, on products in which these manufacturers and producers are putting onto the market. So yeah, I think extending schemes like that will have a massive impact in pricing this stuff effectively.
You raise some really important points here, because it gives us a look into why isn't circularity mainstream yet? What's blocking the shift here? Apart from incumbent industries not wanting to change, and fossil fuel companies and fast fashion brands and packaging giants benefiting from keeping waste profitable, it's very important to also note, like, governments and investors need to push harder for change. Otherwise, we're going to keep moving slow. So very relevant, that part of the discussion. We just broke down how circularity could cut 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually, which is 10% of global emissions, and eliminate hundreds of millions of tons of waste. Talked about, not discovered. Not Vasco da Gama, but okay. We've talked about Recommerce, which is basically like $170 billion industry in itself. But, here we are still drowning in plastic, textile waste, and single-use everything. We know circularity works. Why aren't we subsidizing waste at every level?
Well, it's a good question. And in a way, we are doing that. A well-functioning government is making sure that the full costs of collection, sorting and recycling of these materials that we throw away are borne by the system. So the system that I'm talking about here is extended producer responsibility, which goes by this concept of the polluter pays principle, i.e. if I'm a polluter and I put something on the market, it's my responsibility to pay for the cleanup. And so if I'm a big brand, I'm a brand owner that, I don't know, produces chocolate and sweets, and I put that onto the market within packaging that isn't designed for recycling, I should be paying for the privilege to be able to put that on the market and essentially to pollute. So these extended producer responsibility schemes, they exist basically in every single country within Europe at the moment because of incoming legislation with the plastics and packaging waste regulation, which should be being finalized this year, which will set rules about how EPR schemes are governed, but also at which price certain things should be. But ultimately, that's down to producer responsibility organizations to set. And I think that these schemes are proven to be really effective in introducing like formal waste management systems. And the reason is because those fees aren't treated like a normal tax. It's because they are ring-fenced for waste management infrastructure. So if I'm a producer and I pay my fees, that money will be managed by this central organization that would then pay for the collection, pay for the sorting, and pay for the recycling. And ultimately, if it's designed well and the fees are set at an appropriate level, it should cover that full system cost. There's some systems which aren't designed that well. And also it's quite difficult to introduce it in emerging markets as well. But we are seeing some progress there.
So extended producer responsibility, or EPR, as you put it, is basically telling the companies, well, you made the mess, so you clean it up. Basically, instead of Coca-Cola, for example, dumping 120 billion plastic bottles into the world every year, it's sort of saying, oh, that's a consumer problem. EPR says, nope, you made it, you deal with it. Basically, that's how it works.
Essentially. And it's as I said, it's paying for the privilege to put this product on the market. But the really clever EPR schemes are designed in such a way that incentivizes better design. So there'll be what they're called eco-modulated fees. So there'll be a different lower price for a more sustainable package, and a higher price for a package that's really difficult to recycle. So that could be a PET thermoform, or it could be a specific material. It would be a different price level, which means that as a business, I have an incentive to design my products better, because it would mean pay like lower EPR fees. So the incentive system should hopefully work out, if it's designed well, to mean that, what we've got on the market is better designed and hopefully will be.
You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of a meme, which I don't know if it's a European thing or if it's an American. I don't know the origin story, but they keep showing this meme of like EU innovation. So innovation in the European Union is sort of attaching the caps with like that are attached to the bottle. Versus innovation in the US is they show, the SpaceX rocket like sort of landing back.
And being taken by the tweezers, yeah.
It almost feels like propaganda at this point of time because it's important. These things are important. And when you're putting into context with like, innovation, EU is not innovating it at all, that sort of narrative that Europe as an entire continent is going through, it's making light of the fact that these things are important or should be important too.
And Europe is so far ahead in terms of the regulation for this stuff. So I said this plastics and packaging waste regulation is coming in, which will be a landmark regulation that will set specific recycling targets for certain material types. It will set recycled content targets by certain dates for material types. So it will say, if you want to put a product on the market, then it has to have achieved this recycling rate, or it has to have achieved this level of recycled content within the material by this date. Yeah. That's only a small part of it, but it's in comparison to other parts of the world, Europe is really leading the way on circularity, and specifically circularity regulation. I mentioned EPR earlier. Europe has got so many EPR schemes because it's regulated and it's mandated to do so. The UK is just introducing its own. But the US, for all of this innovation around this, is so far behind. And yes, there are different states thinking about EPR. Colorado and California come to mind as the lead in this. But I think around 10 to 12 states at the moment are really pushing for an EPR scheme this year. But there's still, around a fifth of total states that exist within America. And so even though EPR schemes have been existing in Europe for decades now, America are only just cotting onto it. So, there's innovation in different ways.
I have been thinking, because I found like countries with strong EPR policies, like Germany, for example, have, and you can back me up on this, have higher recycling rates or landfill use and cleaner cities. And that made me think, well, why isn't this a global standard yet? And I found out that in 2021, when EU proposed stricter EPR rules, corporate lobbying groups actually spent over 100 million euros trying to kill it. Because if companies suddenly have to pay for their waste, that's billions in lost profit.
Absolutely. But what we're seeing now, interestingly, is with this regulation coming in, they have to meet certain targets. Like if I'm a Coca-Cola, or I don't mean to call out Coca-Cola here, but if I'm a Coca-Cola and I don't have a certain level of recycling in Europe, then I won't be able to place my products on the market. And those targets come from PPWR. And that's a massive economic risk for me. Like if I can't sell my product in France or Germany or in the UK, then that's a huge economic risk. So I actually, as a Coca-Cola, I might be incentivized to contribute to the waste management system to ensure that my PET bottles are recycled in practice and at scale across the regions in which I want to sell it. So they don't like EPR because of the fact that they need to pay to put their products on the market. But if that EPR enables a better waste management system that improves their recycling rates, then actually they should be pro it.
Really makes you think with what Trump is putting ahead, setting an example in the US, with as simple a thing as like removing the ban from the plastic straws. And it doesn't hit people that even though it's shrouded as like, oh, we're making this healthier for you because, other kinds of things are bad. What they're not saying is we're literally using taxpayer money to make plastic waste cheaper. Because in 2023 alone, governments collectively pumped $7 trillion into fossil fuel subsidies, which is 12 times more than what we spend for renewable energy. And a huge chunk of that money is going into keeping prices for virgin plastic low.
Yeah. Which is such a big problem.
Right.
The subsidies that these petrochemical companies and fossil fuel companies have to generate plastic means that the virgin plastic production is super cheap, and means that, the recycled plastic often isn't competitive on a price level versus the virgin. So as a business, if I'm struggling to, on my margins, and one way in which I can improve my margins is by reducing the cost of the materials that package my product, and I might be incentivized to use the virgin because it's cheaper. But this is when the regulation comes in, right?
Right.
If the regulation says, no, you have to use a certain proportion of recycled content, then it will only increase the demand for the recycled content, which hopefully would spur more investment and lead to economies of scale down the line, which hopefully would make it cheaper, even if demand, like classic economics, demand goes up, price goes up, which you really see in the short term. But as like recycling companies and waste management companies see the opportunity in this with the regulation, then more will come up, capacity will increase, and therefore we should see prices fall in the long term.
It's just to put this ridiculousness right now instead that what we're doing instead. It's almost like burning your house down first and then getting rewarded with a discount on matches.
Yeah.
Maybe what we can also discuss here is about textiles. What about textiles? Do they have the same problem?
Problem with what?
For example, virgin polyester.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I mean, textiles, in terms of like fiber production, 2/3 of all fiber produced is synthetic. And so I think it's over 54% is polyester. And so the plastic problem isn't just with plastic packaging, but it's within the clothes that we wear, like to a significant proportion. And so, yeah, the plastic problem is massive in textiles.
It's almost like they're not ready to spend money on everything that's required to produce recycled textiles, be it collecting, sorting, or processing. It's all going to cost a lot of money, but we just need to flip these pricing incentives here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think textile to textile recycling, which would be more of a closed loop, is proving to be quite difficult economically. There's been a few recycling textile startups that have gone bust over the past couple of years, and they're finding that it all comes down to price. Again, we've spoken about the virgin versus second-hand price, and the content in which they're producing is much more expensive than a clothes or fashion house can get firsthand. And therefore, there's just no incentive for them, unless the regulation comes through, as we've spoken about, to introduce this recycled content. Maybe there's a first mover advantage with this stuff by saying, Patagonia clearly has built a brand for itself as being the sustainable fashion house. And therefore, they have an advantage there. But it almost feels like for other brands, it may be a bit of like a tick box exercise. So they still know that they can make bigger margins and more money from using virgin materials. And so there is that lack of incentive in the system. How
do you think we can flip where the money's flowing in terms of like investments for investors? Because of course, investments are not going, like you mentioned, it's harder to invest in those companies are going bust for recycling textiles. How do we flip where the money flows?
I think a lot of it will come down to subsidies for green businesses, which would then make them more attractive for investors like VCs and whatnot. And so if we can price virgin material at an appropriate level that takes into consideration all of its negative externalities, then there will no longer be a green premium associated with recycled content. And maybe subsidies will help, maybe there's a tax will help. And so I think we just need to price it appropriately. That will then cause more investment into the more sustainable infrastructure and more sustainable businesses.
And I think BlackRock is also doing an amazing job with like a green bond fund.
Yeah, there are a few floating about.
Maybe would you want to talk a little bit about solutions like the Inc. 5 here?
One super exciting thing that's happening within the plastics industry at the moment is INC, the INC Plastics Treaty. It's a way to essentially develop an internationally recognized treaty on plastic pollution with the over-ambitious goal to basically stop plastic pollution altogether. We've spoken before about how there are problems with international agreements like this because of the power of the veto. And you've got to remember that every single line and every single word needs to be agreed by every single country. which in a way made the Paris Agreement back in 2016 such an amazing feat that they were able to agree on this. The Plastics Treaty aims to do something similar, but there are incentives from petrochemical nations that rely on plastics as a big contributor to their economy to essentially continue to producing plastic. And therefore, the process at the moment with INC5, which happened towards the end of last year, failed to end up in an agreement. But what we're likely to see will be like a treaty of the willing. 100 to 120 countries that will remain super resolute in their commitment to securing an ambitious treaty that embraces this idea of like a full life cycle approach. So one that not only reduces plastic pollution, but one that embraces better design for recycling, one that has other circular economy approaches. It phases out hazardous chemicals like PFAS and essentially ensures that there will be like a robust financial mechanisms in place to support emerging and developing nations and support formal waste management systems in those places as well. So I think it could be super powerful. We're likely not to see a full agreement of every single country in the world, but we will likely see a treaty of some kind, like this year in 2025. It will likely be of those high ambitious nations rather than 200. And especially with Trump in power, he would never ever choose to sign something like this, considering they've already left the Paris Agreement within his first couple of days of office in January.
It's like every 4 years we're going here and there, here and there.
Yeah, exactly.
As you mentioned, INC, so that's Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastics, right? Will that be legally binding treaty?
It would be legally binding, yeah.
How would they be? How would they plan to enforce it?
It's kind of like how do you enforce anything? The Paris Agreement is a legally binding treaty that enforces it through the NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions. I imagine it will be some kind of similar enforcing mechanism where every nation sets its own targets and how it would meet the wider plastics treaty agreement. I don't think they've come up with exactly how it will be enforced, but hopefully we'll find out more detail this year should like a treaty of the willing come about in 2025.
So basically how 2024 has left us is the EU and the global south want strict rules, and they're like, oh, let's stop making so much plastic and let's have better systems. And US and big oil is basically, how about we build better landfills at this point? So that's where we've left things, but we're hoping that it comes to some sort of agreement eventually.
Yeah, but you've also got to think about how long these agreements take. Like, it was extremely ambitious to try and think that we would actually have an agreement within 2 years, which was the process of the INC for plastics. The Paris Agreement took far longer than that. And so, yes, there was disappointment at INC5 that an agreement wasn't reached, but I think in reality, it was always going to be super difficult to do that. And so, additional meeting scheduled at some point this year will hopefully enable an agreement of some sort.
Right. And I think it has some value to reiterate, because I think we've covered it at different points during the podcast. If you're not tackling plastic, we're literally subsidizing fossil fuel in disguise. And I think that baseline is it's not something that is at the front of people's minds when, for example, Trump is out there saying, oh, we don't ban plastic straws anymore. The impact is not really considered, like it doesn't strike in your brains yet. By your brains, I'm not being condescending, I'm saying our brains yet. Jesus. That sounded wrong.
Yeah.
It's like I'm being all hoity-toity. It's like, I know better than you. I really don't.
No, definitely no.
We've covered what is like the textile and the fashion industry is. Less than 1% of textiles being recycled. We've talked about how Recommerce and circular fashion can fix this, how that industry is really growing. Brands like Patagonia, like you mentioned, I think Levi's and H&M are trying to build this resale into their business models as well. The positive impact it could have on cutting textile waste by 50% and avoiding that 1.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions. Maybe now is a good time to shift to another one of my favorite sections, which is busting myths and controversies. Are you ready?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
We might have covered things here and there, but I think it's just like a fun way to replay certain thing
Yeah.
here. I'm going to throw out the biggest myths people love to repeat, and you tell me why they're dead wrong, or maybe I'm dead wrong. But either way, okay, we've sort of covered this, but again, circularity is too expensive to scale.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I would argue, and I think most people in the sustainability profession would argue, that the costs of not doing anything massively outweigh the costs of cleaning it up, basically. So it's the same with emissions. Like, the costs of continuing to pollute and continuing to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere will massively outweigh the costs of implementing infrastructure for clean energy. And so if we continue doing this linear take, make, waste system, it's only going to cost us more down the line to deal with. And we've spoken about how much is thrown away in value every single day, like billions and billions a year. And so it could be relatively profitable long term to think about how we can recover that value back.
Are there any industries where circularity really is expensive to scale at this point of time? Because I don't want to put down, this rule and gold anywhere, because I want to be more empathetic and understanding towards other industries. So just to sort of, if we were to discuss that it's harder to scale in certain industries, what would those be?
I think it would be tough to scale in like end of life for energy infrastructure. I think that would be difficult, but we have got companies doing it today. For example, like taking old wind farms, wind turbine, the blade, it's super difficult to recycle because of its complex material composition and how it's made up of so many different things. Ultimately, all you can really do is repurpose it. Like I've seen wind turbine blades being repurposed as like bus shelters, for example, the rain off. But it's very difficult to then extract that material and recycle it properly when you break it down. So maybe a bit more difficult in certain areas of energy infrastructure, but we are still seeing progress with the recycling of old solar panels. I think that's a massively lucrative industry. It's tough, but I think there's examples of good news and things happening well everywhere. Yeah, there are areas in which it will be more difficult. But there are examples of like green shoots and good news in every single industry, but they just don't exist at the scale in which we need them yet.
I might have a guest soon, actually, who's working with the space of recycling wind turbines. It's also, there's another name for it. Windmills? Is that a thing?
Windmills are like the older stuff you see in the Netherlands.
Wind turbines. Well, okay, something. Oh my God, I had a brain fart. But I imagine electronics also a little bit tricky because of all the blended materials and the hazardous components that are involved.
One of the big things that makes recycling work is design. And so if we can design products to be either reused or repairable, but it's not ultimately recyclable at the end of life, then it will go a long way to ensuring that we can get value from it back and put it back into the system. So you mentioned those like electrical products that are super difficult to take apart manually because they might have like different materials fused upon each other. Design is so important, really prevalent, and a big hot topic in packaging at the moment. How can we design our products to be recyclable? Because ultimately that will drive up recycling rates.
Couldn't agree more. How about we move on to the second myth? Fiber-based packaging is always better for the planet.
Yeah, and so fiber-based packaging, we mean paper, something with a paper board as its composition, just to make sure that the listeners understand.
Right. Like how big brands love to promote their eco-friendly paper cups and biodegradable bags. So like mushroom material packaging could also be.
Yeah. So when you say fiber-based packaging, typically it would be something made out of paper pulp or wood pulp. And so there we have been seeing a shift from brands away from plastics in towards more paper-based products. And this is because the consumer sees paper as more environmentally friendly. But yeah, this is not always the case. On the whole, fiber-based packaging is better from an emission standpoint. It's far better than the plastics equivalent, but it also depends on how that particular fiber is sourced and whether it's sourced in a sustainable way. And then I mentioned design just now, but it also depends on how it's designed. And so there can be some really complex fiber-based packaging structures that make it really difficult to recycle. So there's some which have fiber, but then on either side, have plastic layers. So what we call like a composite material, i.e. a combination of a few different material types. And that can be really quite difficult to recycle versus like a PET bottle, for example, where we have the systems already in place largely across most parts of the world to be able to recycle that and for there to be multiple different loops. So when you're comparing, for example, plastic fiber-based packaging, there are so many different variables, but on the whole, packaging is recycled at a much greater level. In Europe, the all total fiber-based packaging is recycled at over 80% in comparison to plastics, which is down in the low teens. And so depends, ultimately, is the long answer.
And that makes a lot of sense what you're saying, because producing paper and fiber-based packaging can use more energy, 4 times more energy than plastic as well. And if, like you mentioned, if it's not sustainably sourced, it just becomes deforestation, but in a different outfit for paper-based packaging at least. And this is one of the things that White House raises as well against paper-based straws, because of the coating of chemicals, the chemical treatments, and some forever chemicals that are not good for your body, which are not there in single-use plastic. So, of course, it's a very nuanced discussion here.
You could have a discussion on this for a very long time, I think. And there's multiple different incentives from both the plastic industry and the fiber-based packaging industry to say which one is better. But what we are seeing, and as I said at the start of that question, is there is a big shift from plastic towards paper, and I expect this year to be quite a significant increase in that shift. But yeah, I think brands need to make sure that they design their products, if they are moving to fiber-based packaging, well, so that the end-of-life systems in which they sell and the markets in which they sell it, then they'll see the benefits for sure.
Last myth of the section, absolutely the last one. Emerging markets cannot prioritize circularity while addressing economic concerns or economic development.
It's a good myth. I think it's valid. It's a valid concern, because they want to grow at the same time as growing sustainably, right? They want that should be a goal for them. But we are seeing this all over the world and examples of circularity, not only in global north countries and developed nations, but in developing and emerging economies. One really good example is the waste management system in Indonesia, insofar as for so long it's failed. There's really no formal waste management system. And that's why you see so much rubbish floating on the beaches, down the rivers, etc. But they have invested recently in formal waste management resources in order to capture it at source and to make sure that there's far less plastic pollution there. And so they can prioritize it, but I think they do still need support in order to do that. And so that could come from private support. So it could come from the brands placing their products on the markets. It could come from like regulation. So it could come from like the EPR schemes that we've spoken about, if that's something that is legislated, that could then fund this formal waste management system. So emerging markets, they should be prioritizing circularity, but I understand why it may be challenging for them. But there are examples all over the world in which these countries are growing at the same time as being able to be circular.
Can I be honest with you? And I might be using a little bit of a harsh language, but it's almost insulting. It feels insulting because I personally I originated in the global south. And it's this myth really pisses me off, because the global south has been doing circularity long before the global north started slapping sustainable labels on everything. The most circular economies in the world are already in emerging markets. For example, in India, 90% of PET plastic is already being collected and reused, but all you get are pictures of dirty India. It really pisses me off. And Nairobi, for example, also has repair and reuse as a core part of the economy. It's not just the economy, it's also culture in these countries. It's just traditionally, even in Philippines, for example, informal waste pickers recover more plastic than formal recycling programs in many Western countries. It's just a different way of saying the global north doesn't want to take responsibility for its own waste. And so we're going to pretend that this is someone else's problem. Because global north has been exporting and this is not even a myth or unverified fact, but global north exports its plastic waste to emerging markets, then turns around and criticizes those same countries for pollution.
The informal sector is massive in these countries, and any introduction of formal infrastructure needs to make sure that we consider the informal sector and the waste pickers that base their livelihoods on, picking up the PET bottles and sending them over to the waste management system or the waste management companies. But the reason why they do that is because there's value. There's value in that waste for them. Okay. So they know that if they can collect a certain weight of PET bottles, they will get a certain price from the waste management company. And so the PET bottles or the aluminium cans or the glass bottles, they have a value. And so you rarely will see a PET bottle lying on the side of the road in an emerging economy because it would have been picked up by someone.
Exactly.
However, you do see other types of waste. So you do see like the flexible sachets or the flexible pieces of packaging. And that's because there's no value associated with it. If you were to put a value on it, then there would not be a pollution problem in these countries.
I love this.
Yeah, which is the key question.
Couldn't agree more. It's like saying circularity isn't just a privilege for rich countries, because saying that would be a lie at this point.
Yeah. I was just going to say one piece of good news that's coming out of regulation in Europe is the Waste Shipment Directive, which the EU is basically signing, which is banning the export of waste from OECD countries to emerging economies. So that is a big problem, us sending waste towards emerging economies that can't deal with it and don't have the infrastructure to deal with it. So legislation like this will stop it and will mean that Europe is forced to deal with it themselves, which is, I think, a good thing.
Love that. I love this section entirely. So we're here to the final section. We want to end with hope. We want to end with solutions, and we want to end with a call to action. We've spent the last hour breaking down how circularity could cut down 5 billion tons of emissions per year, why the current system rewards waste instead of reuse, and we busted the biggest myths holding back circularity. And now we want to end with something positive, because I don't want listeners walking away with thinking, well, this was depressing. I want them thinking, all right, let's go fix this. So tell me and you have covered this quite a bit, but what's happening in circularity right now that actually gives you hope for 2025? And I know you've listed quite a few things already, but what are you most excited about in 2025?
I think regulation is a big thing, and the positivity of regulation coming from Europe to hopefully then spread across the rest of the world really does give me hope. And often when I'm consulting with teams that I work with or with some of SYSTEMIQ's clients, we often think, if only there was some legislation that could deal with this for us, or if only that regulation could price this particular piece of waste at an appropriate rate. We are seeing that. And I think in Europe, it's doing really well. So that's great. I think the other thing that really gives me hope is the rise of these second-hand business models that are generating cash and revenues for these businesses. Recommerce in fashion is like the obvious example of it. And that really gives me hope because of what I mentioned before, in that you don't have to care about sustainability to care about secondhand fashion because of this affordability element. And so anything which makes circularity cheaper than virgin will undoubtedly make it scale at an astronomical rate. So I think that really does give me hope. Yeah. So really positive regulation coming in that will hopefully price these things effectively, and the upstart of these really exciting circular business models. And I'm seeing it all the time, like these startups that are building these circularity business models, multiple different sectors. I think that's really positive.
So true. Even, the part with Caterpillar, the cattle, gives me hope for our manufacturing. Because again, it also, I think this is one thing that we haven't sort of touched upon, but it was one of the reports that I worked on for BNP Paribas.
Yeah.
Basically the role of financial institutions within circularity for companies, because for companies like cattle, they need to have this agreement with their customers because it's really long-term lease, usually like 10 years or so for a farming equipment that goes back. So there's a financial lease involved as well. Again, it's very hopeful for the kind of business model that product as a service entering into those kinds of questions. Final message that you would like to leave the listeners with, whether the listeners are businesses or listeners are just consumers, either way. Up to you.
Final message. My final message would be that the circular economy is absolutely essential to not only reducing waste, but massively reducing emissions. And so I think we all have an incentive to make sure that it works going forward. But it's looking hopeful. Yeah, really excited and looking forward to what's happening in 2025 for sure.
Yeah. For the US as well, I think I would say something like, how fast can you catch up before your competitors can outpace you? Just saying, stop doing all the weird regulation shit you're doing there. I need to bleep out certain words. But let's be real, waste is just bad business people. If your business model only works by throwing things away and pretending like it's not your problem, then you don't have a business model. You have a trash management strategy, to put it at its best. But circularity, like we mentioned, it's not just about saving the planet. It's about building businesses that actually make sense. So to everyone that's listening, if you're in business, fix your supply chains. If you're in policy, make waste expensive, please. And if you're a consumer, ask harder questions. Go ahead. Ask, especially consumers in the US. Ask harder questions to Trump, please. Because circularity isn't a utopian dream. It's $1 trillion reality. We just have to scale it. Daniel, this is absolutely incredible. Thank you for breaking it all down for us.
It's been a pleasure, Divya. Thank you for being such a great host. Really appreciate it.
All right. If you like this episode, stay tuned for more conversations. Okay. How do you feel?
Yeah, it was good. On the whole, that was like a really nice conversation. And I think the way that you framed it was really cool. Like breaking down the problem and then talking about the different elements of it. And especially like the way that you were able to explain it as like for a 5-year-old, that was great. Like, I was able to see that, so well done.
I think I started doing it from the last episode. So last episode, I had a conversation with the VP of Energy at Electra, and that was a really good conversation. But also at the same time, what I'm trying to do on the side is like sort of from word of mouth, I'm trying to get more feedback from listeners who are not exactly in the field.
Yeah.
Sort of listen to what they're saying, because the idea is to make these conversations more accessible and quantifiable so that they know what to care about and how much to care about. And one thing that I got in common from a smoke screen test of like 5-6 listeners was we're following what you're talking about and the numbers seem important and everything. But sometimes we get lost on terminologies.
Yeah.
Certain things like maybe when you're talking, when you yourself know the subject and your guest knows the subject, it's easier to forget that maybe the listener is not really that well versed with it. And I'm like,
really, really good point. And I think so much of sustainability can be quite jargon heavy. So the more that you can push your guests to like break it down, I think the better for sure. And it will only be more accessible. Because we want people who don't know about this stuff to listen to it.
Exactly. So for example, me as well, when I heard Trump saying plastic straws, like the first thought that sadly wasn't the first thought that popped into my mind that, he's supporting the petrochemical industry here. And that's why these conversations need to be like on repeat, putting them into context. Like there's a lot of recognition of topics, even within people who know these subjects. There's recognition, but there's hardly as much recollection. There's this difference as well. And sometimes I find like a lot of colleagues who feel like sort of ashamed to like get up and ask a question that they think is seemingly stupid because they should have known that because it's basic. Honestly, there's no shame. Like the more you clarify, the better it is for everyone's understanding.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, you make a really good point there. I think.
Thank you.
It's also people in the industry.
You just heard Climate Conversations with Divya, brought to you by Purple Fix Productions. We hope today's episode sparked new ideas and deeper curiosity about how we can tackle climate change together. Until next time, this is Climate Conversations with Divya. Stay curious, stay engaged, and let's shape a sustainable future together.